Have you ever tried to make yourself believe something? Not simply say you believe it, not just act as though it were true, but to genuinely become convinced. Because the more I think about it, the less certain I am that belief is something we choose at all. And if we don't choose to believe something, how responsible can we really be for believing it? I think I started to really think about this question when I looked back at my own experience of losing my faith. You see, there was times during my transition from believing in God to not believing in God, where I genuinely, actively wanted reasons to keep believing, because it would have made my life much easier. I wouldn't need to reconsider so much of what I thought I understood. I wouldn't have to deal with the complete uprooting of my entire worldview. I wanted the certainty. I wanted the world to still make sense to me. But wanting to believe something wasn't enough to make me actually believe it. I couldn't simply wake up one morning and decide, right, that's it, today I believe in God again. I could read more, I could watch debates, I could speak to people with different perspectives, and perhaps those things might influence me. But I couldn't decide in advance which arguments I was going to find convincing. That part just didn't seem in my control. And I think this is true of most beliefs. You cannot simply choose right now to believe that there is someone standing directly behind you. You can imagine it, you can pretend that it's true, you might even turn around and look. But unless you have some reason to believe that there is actually someone there, you cannot simply force yourself to believe it. And I find that strange, because we often talk about beliefs as though people have chosen them. We blame people for what they believe, and we praise others for reaching the beliefs we deem to be correct. Sometimes we even tell people what they should believe. But how do you do that? How do you force someone to believe something? How do you force yourself to find something convincing when you just don't? So from that perspective, belief doesn't seem like just any old decision. I can decide to pick up a book, but I can't decide whether that book will persuade me. I can choose to listen to an argument, but I cannot simply choose whether that argument will convince me. And I think that does create a problem, because if we're not in control of what convinces us, how responsible can we be for holding a particular belief? I didn't feel as though I chose to stop believing in God. In fact, at the time, I probably had far more emotional reasoning to keep believing than I did to let go. But eventually, I just wasn't convinced anymore. And I couldn't reverse that by just trying harder. So perhaps we should be slower to condemn people for simply being unconvinced and pay closer attention to how honestly they arrived at that position. Because although I couldn't choose whether I believed in God, I could choose how honestly I approached the question. I could read arguments both for and against his existence. I could take my doubts seriously. I could listen to people who challenged me rather than just people who made me feel more reassured. So perhaps we don't control the belief itself, but we do have some control over the process in which the belief forms. And I think that distinction matters. There is a difference between being wrong because you never encountered a convincing reason to think otherwise, and deliberately avoiding a challenge because you're frightened of what it might change. In the first case, somebody might simply be mistaken, and in the second, they are helping to preserve that mistake. They may not have chosen the belief directly, but they are choosing to protect it from scrutiny. And perhaps that's where responsibility begins. Now, I think the difficult part of this is recognizing when we're doing it ourselves. It's easy to see somebody else trapped in an echo chamber, but it's much harder to see when our own beliefs are being defended in similar ways. We rarely tell ourselves, I'm avoiding this because I don't want to be proven wrong. Instead, we decide the other person is biased, that their argument is ridiculous, or that the subject simply isn't worth our time. And sometimes those judgments are justified. Being open-minded doesn't mean treating every claim as equally credible. We don't have the time to investigate every conspiracy theory or fringe argument we encounter. But there is a difference between rejecting something for good reason and refusing to understand it out of fear that it might be true. So perhaps the question we should ask ourselves isn't, have I listened to every possible opinion? But have I genuinely tried to understand the strongest reason I might be wrong? And I find that question uncomfortable, because none of us can really be certain that we're ever being 100% intellectually honest. What we find convincing is shaped by more than just evidence alone. It can be influenced by what we want to be true, by what the people around us believe, by the communities to which we belong, and by what would be most convenient for us to keep believing. We might even mistake what we want to believe for what we genuinely believe. And that opens the door to a much larger question of how can we ever really be sure what we believe? But luckily for you, I think that question deserves a video of its own, so I'll leave it for now. But in terms of the question today, this is where I land. I don't think we can directly choose what convinces us. So I'm not sure it makes sense to blame somebody simply for being unable to believe something we think they should. But that doesn't mean we have no responsibility at all. We are responsible for whether we examine our beliefs honestly, whether we engage with serious challenges, whether we confront evidence that makes us feel uncomfortable, and whether we remain genuinely willing to change our mind. Perhaps we aren't responsible for what ultimately convinces us, but we may be responsible for how honestly we allow ourselves to be convinced. We may not choose what we believe, but perhaps we can choose whether we give the truth a fair chance. So then, I'm still not sure I completely understand what it means to believe something, or precisely where the responsibility begins. But those are just some of my thoughts, and I'd obviously, as always, genuinely love to hear some of yours. So let me know in the comments, and if you enjoyed this sort of discussion, then please consider subscribing. Thanks so much for watching. Take care. Bye.